Hello, friends. The movement continues, and honestly, few expected it to end quickly. In conflicts like this, the first days are usually the noisiest, the most spectacular, the most full of statements and promises. But that is exactly when it becomes easiest to see whether there was a real plan or only an impulse of force, because it is one thing to strike hard in the first hours, and another thing to know what you are doing after you have struck. And this is exactly where the problem of this episode seems to be. There was an initial strike that produced shock, produced images, produced the feeling that everything could end quickly, a blitz-type operation, in which someone believed that if you decapitate the leadership, if you hit the command infrastructure, if you create panic in the first hours, the regime will stagger, fractures will appear, capitulations will appear, negotiations on your terms will appear. It sounds good on paper, it sounds spectacular in briefings, it sounds perfect for headlines. But reality is more stubborn than plans on paper. Yes, the initial strike was heavy. Yes, an important part of the leadership was eliminated. Yes, the symbolic impact is huge. But the real question is not whether the strike was powerful. The real question is whether it changed the direction of the state you attacked. And this is where the uncomfortable part begins for those who confuse the elimination of some people with the collapse of a system. An authoritarian, ideological regime built vertically does not function like a company that freezes if the chief executive disappears. Such systems are built precisely for crisis situations. They have protocols, they have succession lines, they have multiple circles of command, they have people prepared to step immediately into the empty places. They can lose top figures, but if they have internal architecture and institutional discipline, they do not necessarily collapse. Sometimes the opposite happens. The external strike strengthens their cohesion, and this is one of the great errors we see repeated in history. The immediate military effect is overestimated, and the short-term political and psychological effect is underestimated. When you strike a leader in such a context, you do not eliminate only a person, you also create a symbol, and if that symbol can be turned into martyrdom, then you have done something that can mobilize exactly the energies you wanted to break. Here is the core of the situation. For the outside public, it may seem simple. A leader was eliminated, therefore the regime should weaken. But for an important part of the ideological and religious base, a violent death is not only loss, it is proof, sacrifice, a call to respond. And exactly this symbolic charge can make the reaction harsher, not weaker. More than that, in a conflict like this, it is not only what the political elite feels that matters, what the masses feel matters. If the population perceives the attack as an external humiliation, even people who do not love the regime can react nationally, not anti-regime. It is a very old reflex. The moment bombs fall, identities rearrange quickly. Some internal critics fall silent, others go into the streets not necessarily for the killed leader, but against the attacker. And from the outside, this difference is hard to see. That is why whoever calculated only the technical effect of the strike and ignored the social and ideological effect may have calculated badly. You can destroy buildings, you can decapitate top layers, you can produce chaos in the first hours. But if the state remains functional, if succession is activated, if new faces immediately appear in place of those eliminated, and if the military response begins quickly, then the strike no longer looks like the beginning of the end. It looks like the beginning of an escalation. An escalation is exactly what we are seeing now. Not only an exchange of strikes, but expansion through a network. That is the correct expression, because we are no longer talking about a single front and a single exchange of fire. We are talking about effects that propagate across the entire region: maritime routes, airspaces, bases, ports, energy infrastructure, markets, and of course, political discourse. When you enter this phase, the conflict no longer belongs only to those who first pressed the button. Secondary actors appear, local calculations appear, nerves appear, mistakes appear. And here something very clear must be said. These days, propaganda and analysis are mixing so intensely that many people no longer know where information ends and theater begins. Each side wants to appear to be in control. Each side wants to show that it is striking exactly where it should. Each side wants to convey that the adversary is desperate while it is calm. In reality, when you see contradictory messages, signals changing from hour to hour, and explanations that clash head-on, it usually means only one thing. The situation is more fluid than they publicly admit. A clear example is the way people talk about maritime routes and the Strait. Everyone understands that one of the vital arteries of global energy is there. Everyone knows that when the area comes under risk, it is not only oil traders who get scared, but the entire economic chain: carriers, insurers, importers, governments, companies. But that is exactly why games of ambiguity also appear. One message says passage will be blocked. Another message suggests that no, not for now. Certain transits are allowed, others are forbidden, exceptions appear, warnings appear. Everything becomes a test of nerves. And let us be honest, sometimes the market does not even need a total blockade to explode. A credible risk is enough. It is enough to have ships sitting at anchor and waiting. It is enough to have 2 or 3 incidents, and everyone else starts recalculating. No one wants to be the next vessel hit. No one wants to become the example in a report filled with smoke and drone footage. So hesitation appears, and hesitation has a cost. It costs money, it costs time, it costs nerves. Insurance premiums rise, logistics costs rise, futures prices rise, and alarmist stories rise too. And the ordinary person sees the result a little later. More expensive fuel, more expensive transport, more expensive goods. That is why it is wrong when someone says, "The Middle East is far away, it does not affect us." Yes, it does affect you, exactly through these nodes. Maybe you do not see the connection immediately, but you feel it at the pump, in bills, in product prices, in plane tickets. And this is where the second major vulnerable artery comes in: aviation. For a great many people, the crisis becomes real only when the flight shows up as cancelled. Until then, it is geopolitics. After that, it becomes your life. When major hubs are closed or restricted, it is not only a vacation that gets blocked. A global network gets blocked. Planes are no longer where they need to be. Crews are no longer where they need to be. Connections break. Cargo stays at the airport. Passengers gather in terminals, and everyone asks the same thing: when does normal return? Only in situations like this, normal does not return through a statement. You can partially reopen airspace and the system can still remain in emergency mode. Companies have to prioritize repatriations, move aircraft, rebuild rotations, recalculate overflight risks. That is not done in an hour, and that is exactly what turns a regional crisis into a global crisis of perception, because images of full airports and cancelled flights circulate immediately. People see the chaos and understand at once. This is not a distant problem. There is also another element, less discussed but essential: the reaction of states in the region that do not necessarily want war, but find themselves caught in it. Some host bases. Others have relations with all players and try not to break anything. Others took steps toward normalization and now are paying a political price for it. In these conditions, every strike in a neighboring state or in a sensitive area has a double effect: military and diplomatic. You do not hit only a target. You also hit the fragile balance that some had been building in recent years. This is where it becomes clear why it is dangerous to treat such regions like a map of points to strike. In reality, each point has relationships, dependencies, agreements, pride, and red lines. If you press them simultaneously, you may get not submission, but generalized irritation. And then public reactions appear, protests appear, internal pressure on leaders appears, harsher messages than they initially wanted appear, and the conflict takes on a life of its own. In parallel, the war of narratives unfolds. Some say we are witnessing a necessary demonstration of force. Others say it is a huge strategic mistake. Some argue that eliminating the leader will permanently weaken the regime. Others say that this is exactly what will strengthen it in the short term. Some speak of prevention, others of provocation. And as usual, almost all are trying to use this crisis for their own internal political battles. This is also very visible in the way the subject is pulled into other conflicts. Suddenly, everyone compares. Everyone shifts the discussion toward their own political obsessions. Some want to use the episode as proof that the world has entered an era of state assassinations. Others use it to justify older wars. Others use it to demonstrate the hypocrisy of their opponents. The result? The public receives more emotion and less clarity. And yet, in the middle of this noise, there are a few things that matter more than all the words. The first is whether the attacked state remains functional. If replacements appear quickly, if the chain of command holds, if the response is coordinated, then the short strike and collapse scenario begins to fall apart. The second is whether regional actors go deeper into the conflict or not. Even without spectacular statements, the simple increase in incidents around bases, ports, and routes can completely change the dynamic. The third is the duration of pressure on energy and transport. This is where it is decided whether we have a shock of a few days or a problem that enters the economy. And let us not forget something important. In a modern conflict, victory is not always what it looks like on television. You can have both camps declaring that they have won. One says, "We reached our target, we proved we can strike where we want, we punished." The other says, "We survived, we remained standing, we responded, you did not break us." From a propaganda point of view, both can sell this story to their own public. From a strategic point of view, however, the question remains, what truly changed? If after the initial shock the regime remains, if the region becomes more unstable, if prices rise, if routes become more complicated, and if radicalization grows, then victory begins to look very different. Maybe you obtained a powerful image, but you opened a dangerous cycle. Maybe you demonstrated military capability, but you reduced the space for compromise. Maybe you struck a symbol, but you created another one. And here appears the most uncomfortable part of the whole story, the lack of a plan for what comes after. The initial strike is only the beginning. What follows? How do you stop the chain reaction? How do you prevent expansion? How do you avoid pushing neighboring states into a position where they are forced to publicly choose a side? How do you protect global routes without turning the region into a field of permanent duels? How do you climb down from the tree of escalation without looking weak? These questions do not have simple answers, and that is exactly why, once again, the difference between real politics and campaign rhetoric becomes visible. In rhetoric, everything is simple. You strike, you win, you leave. In reality, you strike, reactions appear, secondary fronts open, costs rise, allies grow uneasy, the adversary adapts, and the market begins to tax every day of uncertainty. And speaking of costs, the world still underestimates how quickly a military crisis turns into an invisible global tax. It does not appear as a new tax, it does not arrive with a stamp. It appears in another way, in gasoline, in transport, in goods, in tickets, in insurance, in delays, in postponed decisions, in investments put on hold. That is the real power of a struck strategic node. It does not produce only an explosion, it produces higher prices. And if all this happens at the same time as other hotspots of tension in the region, including at sensitive borders from the direction of South Asia, then the pressure on the corridors between Europe and Asia grows even more. You do not have a single fire, you have several, and global networks have to pass between them. When bypass routes also become risky or congested, the cost is no longer only economic, it becomes strategic. States begin to think in terms of resilience, companies in terms of operational survival, and the public in terms of fear. That is the atmosphere we are living in now, not necessarily the certainty of a total catastrophe, but the accumulation of a dangerous uncertainty, and sometimes that is exactly more destabilizing than a single event. People can adapt to one clear bad piece of news. They adapt more difficultly to a continuous flow of contradictory signals, threats, alerts, pinpoint strikes, and temporary suspensions. It exhausts you, it tenses you, it makes you react emotionally, and politics, propaganda, and markets know very well how to profit from that. That is why, in this period, the most useful thing you can do is not chase every viral clip, but follow the real indicators. Are the maritime routes functioning or not functioning? Is air traffic stabilizing or not? Are incidents around critical infrastructure decreasing or multiplying? Are de-escalation channels appearing or only more aggressive messages? From the answers to these questions you will understand more than from 100 hysterical monologues. And one more thing, it is very tempting, especially online, to turn everything into a film with simple heroes and villains. But the real world does not work like that. Here you have leaders playing for domestic audiences, armies striking and testing limits, neighboring states trying not to be dragged in, markets reacting to rumors, and millions of ordinary people who decide nothing but pay the bill. The moment you forget this last category, you begin to talk about war as if it were a sport, and that is one of the greatest moral degradations of our era. Now, if we look coldly at the overall picture, one simple thing becomes visible. We have entered a stage in which it no longer matters only who had the initiative, but who can manage the consequences. Initiative can be spectacular. Managing consequences is boring, technical, and extremely hard. But that is exactly where things are won or lost in the medium term. If you do not have an answer to the question, and after that, then you can turn a tactical strike into a strategic problem, and perhaps here is the most important conclusion. We are not yet at a point where anyone can honestly say they have complete control. Everyone is performing the image of control. Everyone wants to appear as if they have the scenario under control, but when you see contradictory signals on energy, chaos in aviation, regional nervousness, rapid responses, and propaganda at maximum intensity, it means we are entering a zone where mistakes cost a great deal. That is why, for those who think everything is far away, it is worth saying directly, it is not far away. Maybe the front is far away, but the effects are close. In a connected world, the distance to your life is not measured only in kilometers. It is measured in maritime routes, air hubs, energy prices, and economic stability. And when these sensitive points are hit simultaneously, the entire world feels the vibration. So yes, we keep watching. But not only with emotion, not only with spectator reflexes, not only with memes and arguments. We watch with the right question in mind. Who actually has the plan for the day after? Because hitting a hornet's nest is easy. What is harder is what you do after they all come out at once, and it is exactly on the answer to this question that it depends whether we remain at the level of one violent and expensive episode or enter a long crisis that will literally hit everything, from geopolitics to the shopping basket. And until we see that answer, one thing is already clear. We no longer live in a world where you can treat such wars as isolated regional conflicts. We live in a world of nodes. And when you strike the nodes, it is not only one point on the map that falls, the whole network shakes.